Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noha Aboueldahab, Assistant Professor of International Law here at Georgetown, and it's a real pleasure to moderate today's discussion and a greater pleasure to introduce our speakers today for this event on food as a weapon, legal perspectives on Palestine. Dr. Michael Fakhri is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, professor at the University of Oregon School of Law. He teaches international economic law, commercial law, and food law, and his research focuses on right to food and food sovereignty. He's also the author of Sugar and the Making of International Trade Law, published by Cambridge University Press. And of course, there are many, many other publications, including his most recent report on the right to food, which was transmitted to the General Assembly in July. An incisive, lucid, damning, devastating report that outlines how interlinked starvation and other violations of the right to food are to other issues such as the right to self-determination, the Palestinian right of return, and so on. So a warm welcome to you, Michael. Dr. Zeina Jallad is the director of the Palestine Land Studies Center and an assistant professor of international law at the American University of Beirut. Her research focuses on human rights, international law, and sustainability, with a focus on the Arab region. Dr. Jallad has 2 decades of experience working with the United Nations across the Middle East and North Africa region, Switzerland, and Laos. She holds a JSD in law and an LLM from Columbia University and a graduate diploma from Beirut University. She's a member of both the Palestinian Bar and the New York City Bar. She's held several academic fellowships, including at Harvard Law School's Institute for Global Law and Policy, Columbia University Center for Gender and Sexuality Law, and NYU School of Law. And she also serves as a senior advisor to the one and only UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And she sits on the board of trustees at Beirut University. Very warm welcome to you, Zeina. Now, over the last few days, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Zeina, especially, and to learn more about her incredible work and her wide-ranging experience in the field of international law and human rights. Michael and I share a history of Twale comradeship, if we can put it that way, third world approaches to international law. And we, in fact, first met here in Qatar in 2013. So it's been really great to catch up with you, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion. So we did start a little bit late. We'll start off with a moderated discussion for about 25 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. Because we don't have much time, but I have a lot of questions. So my first one to both of you, could you just briefly explain to us your current roles and what they mean and how your previous professional and academic experiences have informed your current roles?
Thank you, Noha. Thank you, everyone. So I'll explain what a UN Special Rapporteur is quite quickly, and then how I ended up working with Dr. Jallad. So UN Special Rapporteurs, our mandate comes from the Human Rights Council, which is the body of the UN where all the governments meet and decide on issues regarding human rights. It's a volunteer position, an independent expert. I'm not the UN, unpaid, but it carries a significant amount of power and authority. So I'm the leading UN authority on the right to food. Another way to think about it is I'm the eyes, ears, and good conscience for the UN system on all matters regarding hunger, famine, and malnutrition. And I often say I'm not a human rights person. I came into this position. My background was more trade and development, but I also come to it skeptical of human rights as a project, skeptical of international law, skeptical of law as a force of progressive change. As Noha mentioned, I come from a tradition, third world approaches to international law, which understands that the origins and ongoing practice of international law have been a part of a project of imperialism, and one could argue also capitalism. But also, maybe since around 1920s, 30s, but definitely after 1955 in Bandung and the independence of many countries in Asia and Africa, there's always been space for resistance within international law as well. So part of, in my work, what I do is I talk to everybody. I talk to heads of state, ministers, peasant movements, labor unions, activists. And because it's on food, I can talk to anybody about anything. And so my job is to learn from everyone and to share what I learn publicly in forums like this and in official reports. So formal duties include 2 reports a year, which I present to the General Assembly, one, and another one to the Human Rights Council. And I set the agenda. So I get to force countries to discuss whatever topic I think they should be talking about on the record, on the formal record. And so the most recent report is entitled Starvation and the Right to Food, with an emphasis on the Palestinian people's food sovereignty. So I've been tracking this particular moment of aggression by Israel since October 7, because on October 9, Israel announced its starvation campaign. And part of the benefits of this position is everybody wants to talk to me because I have this platform, but then I can also reach out to anybody. So I also know my limits. I know generally, geography and history of Palestine, being from Lebanon, or growing up in a household that was very politically aware, but I didn't know the legal perspectives from Palestine itself, and I didn't know Israel's legal tactics. So I know sort of the international stuff, and then I met Dr. Jallad in a reading group she was organizing, and I found her very clever. And in the midst of the reading group, I'm an awful student. Before the session, dear Zeina, you don't know me, but I need your help. And that's how it worked. And so these reports, and I put hard copies of the report there in the back somewhere. One is the full report, which is the text and illustration, but I also then printed out just the illustrations because they're freestanding. This is the first UN human rights report in which we included illustrations. I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be back here. I was here 2 years ago. The way I think in my situation, it's the reverse exercise. So I was born and brought up in Ramallah, and then I grew up witnessing firsthand what does land confiscation mean, what does it mean to be a child growing up in a family where your parents are incapable of protecting you. And I thought law would provide the answer. So I was this very ambitious person who wanted to study law, and then I thought international law can provide solutions. Fast forward 10 years doing a JSD at Columbia University, trying to understand where I studied with Omar. And then I was trying to understand why law fails in the Arab region, why international law fails in providing the answers for the people in the Arab region. And then so my exercise has been understanding international law, what are international law dynamics, at the same time continuing to practice law in Palestine. And to practice law in Palestine, you need to understand how the law operates there, and how domestic laws are operating in that space. And then we have laws from the 1800s up until today that are operating in that space. So how can we understand the limits not only of international law, but how law operates in a space that is so fragmented, and the law becomes a tool for further fragmentation, what I call in my work, suffocation through the law. So this what my role has been in supporting Michael in. Let's understand what is the architecture there, what's the landscape, how law is being used and deployed as a tactic to further fragment the Palestinian people, exterminate the Palestinian people, and it's all by design. And it's never like by a full scoop of legal formation. It's an incremental usage of the law. So we have an accumulation, this patchwork, this very, what people like to use as rich history, rich legal history. I don't use it as it's not rich at all. It's a complicated legal history that continues through the design of the law to make people's lives impossible. So if we talk about today extermination of the Palestinian people, it's not coming as a coincidence. It's not the fast killing of the people today. And my role is to try to understand how the legal systems, how legal pluralism in that space is actually contributing to the slow death of the Palestinian people.
Okay. And on that, actually, so could you tell us a bit about the role of Israeli law in facilitating the space to perpetrate mass starvation.
So, if I can take a step back, for us, like today in Palestine, the legal systems that operate at the same time. So we have the Ottoman laws, we have the British laws, we have the Jordanian laws, Egyptian laws in Gaza, as well as over 2,500 military orders. And these 2,500 military orders, they regulate people's lives and organize Palestinian lives in every single aspect of it. Oslo Agreement, the way it was crafted, the creation of Oslo Agreement, it was a design, but under the auspices of the 2,500 military orders, including certain aspects that has to do with the age of childhood, for example. So according to international law, the age of childhood is 18. Israel, again, I said this earlier, like the only democracy in the Middle East which ratified CRC, the age of childhood is also 18. But when it comes to Palestinians, the age of childhood can become as early as 12 to consider Palestinians as combatants. The Israeli laws not only deal with situations where Palestinians are living in Jerusalem or Palestinians are driving in what so-called roads leading towards settlements, but really it regulates every single aspect of Palestinian lives, including what color do we paint the minarets of the mosques. And there are more than, like, really, if we map, and we were talking about this with Abdullah, if we map the 2,500 military orders, we understand why we're here today. Because there is a military order on the olive harvest. There is a military order on the right to assembly. So if we are all of us going today to Burqin or a village somewhere around Nablus to do the traditional annual festivity of olive harvest, it's regulated through a military order. Access to lands, access to resources, access to water, access to the very, very basic rights of the Palestinian people are all organized through military orders. And these military orders, they operate at the same time as when you have Oslo Agreement, at the same time as when you have all of this colonial history of legal systems, as well as the Palestinian laws. So even the creation of the state of Palestine, the creation of this entity, the dream of the Palestinian people, it operates under the military orders. So we have Palestinian laws, but these are all within the limit is in Israeli laws. And let alone the story of Jerusalemites and all that part of the story.
Michael, we know that starvation, other sort of right to food have affected many parts of this region and other parts of the world. Sudan is very much at the forefront of our minds here as well, Yemen and Syria and others. How has Gaza served as a sort of window into the starvation tactics in other parts of the world?
I'll start very general, and then I'll sort of focus on the different situations, and then on why Gaza and Palestine specifically. So part of what I needed to do was to pull starvation out of the regime of international humanitarian law and the laws of war first. Right now, in international law, starvation is a war crime. But the problem there is that's too narrow. One, because it assumes that starvation only happens in times of war, which is not true. Starvation is structural. It is a slow, long-standing process that by the time it happens, and usually it's in the time of conflict, it's too late to stop or change anything. So we have to understand famine and starvation is a structural process. The food system is by design created in a way. Political structures are designed in a particular way that gives people the choice to then starve people as usually a weapon of war. So one, it doesn't always happen in times of war, and to prevent it, you need to prevent it before wartime. And two, in terms of accountability, in terms of international criminal law, it's in the Statute of Rome and the Treaty of Rome, and you can take someone, individuals. But that's the problem then, is it assumes that certain bad people are the cause of famine and starvation. And the first time there's been an attempt to seek a arrest warrant on starvation crimes is now with Netanyahu and the former Minister of Defense, Jallad. They're still seeking to get an arrest warrant. Like, right? If this was Ukraine, this would have happened in a minute, right? So I needed to pull it out of that and to make it a human rights issue and an international issue, to say that starvation is a fundamental violation of international law writ large. So that's the principle. Now, to do that, the reason I focused on Palestine. So what's happening in Sudan? Sudan is the largest case of starvation we've ever witnessed in modern history. 24 million people are facing famine. It's incomprehensible. Yemen has been facing famine for years and ignored. I could go on, Haiti, etc., etc. So what we're seeing is an increased risk of violence and starvation around the world. And it's not going to stop anytime soon. The reason is every major power in the world, every permanent member of the Security Council, and many rich countries either directly or indirectly support starvation. So what's at stake is the global order itself. So when I got asked at the UN, I presented this report at the General Assembly, why did you focus on Palestine? I said, that's the wrong question. The question is, why did millions of people immediately mobilize in support of Palestinian human rights in ways we've never witnessed in history, calling for an end to genocide, an end to the war, and a free Palestine? Palestine as a territory is now back in the popular imagination. And it's because everyone recognized their own struggle in the Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian struggle in international laws is at the core of the UN, at the core of international law. The way food has been weaponized in Palestine, everyone recognized the degrees of the forms of exploitation, occupation, and oppression, the forms of violence. They saw their own struggle, except what's happening in Palestine is at an accelerated pace. What we saw in Gaza is the fastest case of starvation we've ever seen, and the most immediate. It hit 2.3 million people almost across the board. What's at stake also in Gaza and in Palestine more broadly is not just, of course, the Palestinian people's liberation struggle, but it's US geopolitical power and European unity. How we will eventually liberate Palestine will be through the same tools that will liberate everybody, but we'll have to fundamentally change the world order itself. That's what's at stake. This is why millions of people have mobilized.
Thank you. So you also just explained sort of the limits of international criminal law as we know it today in addressing something like this. And in your report, you also mentioned that, I mean, among many other things, the absence of accountability increases the risk of famine, right? So I'm interested to know how you both think that accountability should look like.
I think in working with Zeina, the question I was asking myself was, how is this much power amassed in the first place? So before we get to accountability, how did any entity, whether it's Israel or the pre-Israel entities like the Jewish National Fund, the corporations that enabled these things from over 100 years ago, or how did both sides in Sudan, both the Sudanese armed forces and RSF, how was this even possible? So I think the question I've been trying to figure that out before we get to accountability is that question. The reason is ultimately because it's not individuals, it's states and corporations. And that's the difficulty. How do we hold corporations accountable? How do we hold governments accountable? The system is still unclear on how to do that. So we see the limits of international criminal law. Okay, let's say we eventually throw these individuals in jail. We saw in Yugoslavia, okay, it takes forever and nothing changes. How do you hold corporations accountable? My frustration with corporate accountability is it's too late. They've already done the damage and they treat everything as a cost. Okay, so many people die, we get sued, we lose some bad PR, but corporations budget for these things. So for me, we have to look into the insides, whether it is the laws operating within Palestine and Israel, or in cases of corporation, corporate law itself. Corporations are designed to limit liability and to maximize profit. They are designed to make it hard to hold people liable. Limited liability corporation, it's in the name. So we have to get into the legal insides of these things, both to understand how, and so that I think that's where I become ambivalent. I'm not sure how to hold them accountable. I'm more at the stage of dismantling. So the argument I made in the context of corporate business and human rights is, you know, when a business violates human rights, they're legal entities. We execute them. Kill the corporation. Khalas, mamnu. Why? We don't need corporations to feed ourselves. When a country commits genocide, khalas, kick it out of the UN. Right?
Thank you. Zeina.
Three thoughts come to mind when we're talking about accountability. In the context of Israeli violations of human rights and Israeli crimes against the Palestinian people as well as the UN, in the entire history of the past modern history, Israel never paid any compensation, not even to the UN. All the destructions, there has been only one precedent when Israel paid for the destruction of food storage and food silos in Gaza. It was when Ban Ki-moon was making a country visit, and he thought that he's been targeted. And that was done through a settlement. That wasn't even done through proper accountability mechanisms. So I think one thought around accountability, what do we think? How do we see accountability? Is it just international criminal accountability, and now we're kind of by default autopiloting, thinking about ICC, ICJ, even maybe a street vendor would know today ICC, ICJ, and would be following on the news of South Africa case and all what is happening. But I do not think that as Palestinians and as an international community and as advocates by the international community, I mean advocates, I do not think we've exhausted possibilities of accountability. And there is more, like there is the corporate leg to it, but then there is the tours, there is the universal jurisdiction. In cases like Syria, we've seen the way universal jurisdiction did work actually, and is in the pipeline of working towards certain cases. And the other thing, when we talk about accountability, when we're thinking about Israel, Israel is not like this random entity that came into this world. It's a product of Europe. Just if we think today, how many Israeli army members and soldiers, fighters in Gaza, they have dual citizenships. More than 3,000 French Israeli fighters. Did we exhaust that avenue? I do not think we've exhausted that avenue. Have we gone after all these of dual citizens to try to prosecute them? I don't think we've done that. If there is more of a legal strategy, how to go around prosecuting Israelis that they feel that they are being prosecuted everywhere they travel, everywhere they go, any business they do, any deal they are doing, then I think there would be a moment for change, and there would be a moment of they besieged Gaza, but maybe we can besiege them through the law today. So I think that what we need to think about, like, how can we use legal besiegement as an avenue for justice? And I had a third thought about accountability, but I forgot.
Okay. So, okay, thank you for that. As my next question is sort of very much related to what you both just said, but I want to zoom out a little bit because you're both critical international lawyers.
I've been called worse.
If I could label you and sort of oversimplify, but yes, as let's say as critical international lawyers, you question international law. Obviously, you question. You're hyper conscious of its limits and indeed its complicity in some of the horrors in our world, and yet you engage in it, and you engage in the United Nations. So, for the skeptics in this room, and there are many. Why do you think it's worthwhile to engage in a system that you see as deeply problematic?
Zeina has heard me threaten to quit 17 times already. That was just like between yesterday and today. I think at this point, so coming from a tradition that has this skepticism or this critical perspective, it used to be that you conclude your analysis with, the limits of international law, bravo. Now, that's, I think, a premise. Like, okay, yes, and. When I stood before the General Assembly, what I actually was looking at was rubble. I was looking at something that wasn't collapsing, but that had collapsed. And it's like the people in it didn't know that the whole system had already collapsed around them. And it was like watching zombies perform all they know, and knowing what they're doing is useless. Right? This is how I experienced the General Assembly. And so all you have is the rubble in front of you. All you have in a moment, like this moment we're experiencing in history, is what's in front of you. So you have to work with what you have. When your house is on fire, you don't think, wallah, we should have had more fire extinguishers. You grab what you have. So grab what you have. One of them is international law. Grab what you have, knowing its limits as your starting point, but then that means you can use it better than anybody else. If your starting point is, I know exactly the limits, but also the strengths of this particular tool, and I'm not going to romanticize it, nor am I going to talk about how useless it is in the midst of a moment. And then you can use it very well, and then you also know the limits of the tool, you know your own limits, and then you know who you have to reach out to work with, and who you have to connect with and what other perspectives you need. And then you also know where then you step out of the law. So which is why then I needed someone who knew how to draw. Because words, not just legal tools, the limits of words themselves. I was going to quit because what do you say after genocide? Knowing nothing's going to change. Another report is what? To what end? And so there was two reasons. I then reached out to an artist friend named Omar Khouri to draw. It was both the limits of words to capture the horror, but the limits of words to also imagine the world past this moment. And what genocide does, it also obliterates your ability to imagine a future. And so stepping out of text into illustrations was the way I needed to get out of, not necessarily law, but what abilities I had.
Thank you. It's just this. I'm just still wrapping my head around. For me, just this year, this fast mode of killing. Yes, as many others I've seen, like, okay, and I've thought a lot about, like, what is the point of international law? What's the utility of international law? Why do we care about international law? But then, again, as a Palestinian, who is witnessing what is also happening now in the West Bank, I think international law is one tool. We've used it to a certain extent, but maybe we've used it more politically, and we've used it as Palestinians. We've used it more performatively, and I think, one, international law, when it comes to UN resolutions, I don't think we need more resolutions. We have enough of that. Two, advisory opinions, I don't think we need more advisory opinions. But again, like, it's one tool. And if we're not using international law and we're just in this very bleak, dark moment, so what do we have left? Where do we turn? And what is available for us? And we're witnessing now this very fast mode of killing in Gaza, but it's creeping. It's a creeping mode of criminality, right? This criminality didn't start today and didn't start on October 7th. It's a continuity. It started in even before 48. And it's a sweeping criminality. So what do we do when we have a mode of sweeping criminality?
Do we just throw the one tool that can do at least something and just sit and cry? I don't want this for myself. I don't want it for my children. I don't want it for the children of Sudan. I don't want it for the children of Yemen. So if international law has still any possibility to do at least 10% of its possibility and utility, I want to exhaust it. And personally, I don't believe that we've exhausted the utility of international law. It's easier to throw in the towel and say international law is not working for me. But I still think international law can work, and we have seen cases, and there are cases where we can use other avenues where international law can become utile. We've seen how the law has worked against us, but maybe today there is a momentum that we can make it work for us. The Arab Bank case is a case where we've seen how Palestinians were persecuted. A bank was held accountable. Maybe today there is a precedent that we can use it in our advantage. So how international law, in its very broader sense, not only public international law, I think still like we have this one window of opportunity. Why to close it amid this very bleak reality where every window is closing one after the other?
Thank you. I have one more question for you before I turn it to the audience for questions. And since we started late, Farah, we can go on to 2:10, right? Okay, perfect. Can you, since throughout your tenure as UN Special Rapporteur, and Zeina, throughout your experience as senior advisor, can you share one story of an experience that has impacted you in a very significant way, perhaps changed you? Yeah.
I can start.
Please.
It was so I was at Harvard Law School. I was in Boston, and it was Eid, and we were working on the report. And Michael was looking into possibilities to engage comics, and I told him, "Look, Michael, why don't we just put a recipe? Why don't we just try to see what does deprivation mean in the details, in the very mundane way of it?" Okay, this is a great idea. What do you suggest? Like, let's just call someone from Gaza and see what they're eating today. So I called them Ahmad, and then of course she didn't answer. Then she sent me a voice message, a very long voice message. And then, because I sent her a voice message, I was like, "Kul aam wa bkhair," I just wanted to check in on you. And I asked her, what did they have for lunch? And then she sent me this very long message about the situation in Gaza, and then the recipe and what they ate. And then I said, "Ahmed, can I forward this voice message to the special rapporteur? I want the international community to know, and I want my voice to be heard." And for her, it was a moment that I want someone to hear my plea. I want someone to hear my cry. I want someone to know that I'm not just someone who's just being deprived. And it was a striking moment for me, the moment of realizing that even like for what is happening, like, so we have the mass destruction around the Palestinian people. There is this mass violation of human rights that shocks us to the core. And then there's also this overall skepticism and cynicism about the possibility of international law, but then also the very basic recipe that gets also erased. So there's this assault even on our, not only agency, there's this assault on our recipes, on our culture, on our identity. And what does a cultural erasure become? Like, people cannot eat their food for years and years and years. Then someone who comes from, I don't know, some random place, they know how to cook falafel and hummus, and us, we don't even know how to cook our sumai and ma'lube. So it was like, for me, it was really a striking moment that the kind of violence that we are witnessing today, it's not only just the physical violence on us and our agency as Palestinians, but there is also a much more profound form of violence on our every single detail. So for me, that was like the recipe moment, and the Mahmoud, it was the most profound moment of this exercise.
And then if you can see, so then we illustrated it. And the comics are 3 vignettes. One is on food sovereignty, one is about fishers in Gaza, and one is the ingredient list. And that's the one where I've gotten the most feedback, where people have said, I didn't understand starvation, like facts and figures, or even pictures in the news. But when you see the ingredient list of a before and after, they said those white spaces are haunting. And I didn't anticipate that of the comics, that would be the one that resonated. Could have predicted. To answer your question, Noha, it's I'll share. I'm reluctant because it's just about my own struggle, but who cares? Like, what's happening? This is what the question is. So from January to April, the issue of starvation was the core issue in the news. And I was doing more media than I've ever done. And I don't do media as a thing. I reached out to Noha a long time ago, like, how do you write an op-ed? And then I would watch Noha's TV interviews to learn how to do them. As an academic, like, I don't like talking to people on TV. Like, it's why, despite this personality, I'm quite shy, actually. But it was the necessity of the job. So what I found myself doing is, before I even put my glasses on, I look at the phone, I get the latest statistics, I have to process the information of what's happening, I have to frame it in a way that makes sense to me, and then I have to go on to do media and say something, and I'm a voice of authority. I can't make a mistake. My tweets are being cited in the courts at this point, and I'm one of the few people who called it genocide in the UN system from the beginning. And now I'm the starvation expert, and I'm from the region. So I felt this incredible pressure, and I'm tracking the war daily. I'm on the news every single day, which is not my natural way of being. I've had to learn how to do this. And then I didn't realize how sick I got. I was physically unable to, I couldn't make choices anymore. And I realized how I wasn't even present enough in my own family. And it wasn't, and what got me through it was actually where I met Zeina and Wadia was at this conference. It was a conference of friends and comrades. It was Twale in New Jersey. I'd been isolated, all online, but then I went to this conference which was on third world approaches, international law, and Palestine, but it was Palestinian lawyers and third world approaches international. It was friends and comrades, yeah. And to arrive to this space, to feel seen and recognized, and to have debates with people, and to share and to meet people. And for me, that's what I realized is, despite all of this, what I got me through, but what I actually gained is friendships. Deep, deep friendships. And I also ended friendships. This is a moment, an existential moment of your true self comes out now. Who are you? We're seeing it. COVID was kind of that to some degree, but now who are you? Before I'd be like, they like that kind of music or they like that movie, they must be a terrible person, right? But this is now a moment of like, who are you? And making the comic with my friend Ahmad Khouri. I know Ahmad Khouri when we were 14 in Lebanon. But we moved to Eugene, we worked on this comic every single day for 3 months, 4 months, and the friendship we formed making this comic. So it's weird to say, but I've come out of this with these deep, meaningful friendships where I'm like, that's all that matters. Not law, not politics, not the UN, is who's around us, who do we take care of, who loves us, and who do we love? Well, best.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael and Zeina. All right. Questions. I think we'll take a couple of questions at a time. If you could keep them very concise, please. And just briefly introduce yourselves as well. Any questions, comments? Wadia? Get a mic to you. Is that?
But they're recording.
It for the recording.
They're recording.
Sorry.
So thank you very much for that, for the discussion, and it's very, I think, to my view, very informative. I wanted to just follow up with a question each. Michael, with respect to you mentioned trying to single out starvation. I'm assuming you're talking about maybe making it into a Jus Cogens norm or something like that. If you could explain that, I think that would be great. And also, I wonder if there's any value to the idea of, in Sudan, the starvation is a kind of a byproduct of a chaotic, nightmarish war. In Yemen, there was a blockade that produced the starvation, but the goal wasn't starvation, whereas with the Israelis, the goal was starvation. And if you see any value in gradations along those norms. Zeina, I have a question for you regarding, because you talked about Palestine, you talked about the West Bank specifically, where there is a legal system, a Palestinian legal system. And I wonder, given that it kind of developed in the post-Oslo world, after all these military orders had kind of taken shape, if you feel that there's been any benefit or anything positive, given that now you can go to Mahkamat al-Bidai in Nablus or whatever, and there's a court of appeals, and there's even, I know it's mildly comical, but a Palestinian Supreme Court. Is there anything positive that's developed? And those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We can take one more question. Okay, we'll come back to the audience.
Thank you, Wadia. So on starvation, the argument I make is that it's not just a war crime, and then what it is, then I argue specifically, is it is always an instance of genocide or extermination as a crime against humanity or torture on an individual basis. So I kept it, yes, Jus Cogens, but within existing categories. The part we had a discussion with Zeina, with others, other friends and comrades that we know, is should I try and define starvation in and of itself as its own Jus Cogens thing? And I think sort of where we all agreed kind of, and I made the call, is let's keep it within existing categories. Because then it connects to your second point, which is, well, what's at stake in starvation? Yes, Israel's goal was starvation, yes and no, but it was a means to displacement and territory. Always, Yemen, Sudan. So starvation, what's happening is it's moving people or killing people in a way to take over territory. So you can't separate understanding starvation without the territorial story. And that's what took me to Zeina's work.
Thank you, Wadia. Regarding the Palestinian legal and judicial systems, so the Palestinian judicial system is started, what is called the creation of the judicial system created around 2000, the basic law 2002. And all was created within the framework of Oslo. The idea is not sovereignty. And also as a product, it's about administration. So the whole project is about how to create a moment of where the Palestinians are doing the work, but without sovereignty. And what is known to be the legislative harmonization process, where there is streamlining laws, never saw the light in Palestine. So when Palestinians started the legislative process, the first law was the basic law, then there was the investment law, criminal law, civil matters, import, export, they never touched. So until today, what we have in terms of land is governed by the Ottoman Majal, and we have the British orders, we have the military orders. When it comes to criminal law, we have the Jordanian criminal law in the West Bank, and we have the Egyptian criminal law in Gaza. So what we do not have a consistency of a legal system. The creation and the formation of the justice system, we have Palestinian courts, but these courts, they have very limited jurisdiction because Oslo created the landscape of dividing and fragmenting further the territory into 3 zones in the West Bank, and let alone Gaza. So basically, if you live in Area C and you have your business in Area C, you can access the court, you can get a legal order, but enforcement is not possible at all. So there is this moment of also not confusion, but there is because of these laws and because of this creation of this confused non-sovereign system, there is a moment of lawlessness. So with legal pluralism, it created a moment of lawlessness for Palestinian people. So I can go to the court, I can obtain a court order for eviction or to get a land order, but then there is no place to enforce it. In the West Bank, all of Area B and Area C that are heavily populated by settlers, there is no legal recourse for Palestinians. So there is this facade of the state of Palestine, but this state of Palestine that lives under occupation lives without sovereignty at all. And this is one side of the story. But then when it comes to import, export, business, everything, we're all governed by the Paris Protocol. Customs, the collection of tax, we're all governed also by these treaties. So we have Oslo Agreement, and people rhetorically refer to Oslo Agreement. But after Oslo Agreement, there has been 18 agreements that continue further to regulate people's lives. So and this is only when we talk about the West Bank. East Jerusalem is another story. Gaza is another story. And when Hamas won in the elections and the divide happened between the West Bank and Gaza, and Fatah took over, the whole legislative process was brought to a halt. So we do not have a legislative council since the elections. And we've been operating for almost now 2 decades on decrees issued by the Palestinian president in the West Bank, while Gaza, they have their own laws. So it's a total legal chaos what we have. And in Gaza, we have also all these lists of what is allowed in Gaza, what is not allowed in Gaza by the Israelis. So the whole legal system in terms of rights, I don't think this whole structure is not an accident. And this whole structure, if anything, is just diluting, just compromising people's rights.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, we have Natalie over here. Please.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'm a senior majoring in international history. My question is kind of specific to Dr. Jallad's question about, your point about military courts. How do you use IHL, which in my opinion is fundamentally flawed, to hold starvation accountable when the law itself promotes starvation? That's, yeah.
Thank you.
I know it's such a broad question, but
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? All right. Okay. Zeina?
I talked about the military orders. Military orders are laws. They have the power of the law in what is designated by the Israelis the civil administration of Yehuda and Samira, which is the West Bank. Now, military courts are also part of the legal structure in Israel, and in the military courts, Palestinians, they can be held accountable in military courts. So speaking about military courts, we have the Palestinian military courts. These are for people who are members of the military, but we don't have a military. And the military courts where Palestinians get prosecuted for violating the public order of Israel. I do not think Palestinians don't have access to the military courts of Israel, but they have access to defend themselves when they get prosecuted before the military courts. So it's not a recourse to justice for us. So for example, when there's a violation of these military orders, for example, when I give the military order on the age of childhood, so if Ahd Tamimi, for example, she was prosecuted based on the military order. The Palestinian lawyer or the Israeli lawyer can access the military courts of Israel to defend this Palestinian who's living in the Yehuda and Samira area. But as access to justice, it's not an avenue for us. So when we talk about starvation, we can talk about the structure of starvation. I'm just thinking creatively now. how can we think about what are the structures that impede people's access to food or access to resources? And then we can think about ways where we can access the Israeli system, which has its own critique, like how Palestinians can access and limits the Israeli system, or think about outside of the Palestinian-Israeli legal systems. But as a route to justice, it doesn't exist.
Sure. I mean, I'll talk about the IHL part. So, it's interesting that to build on the points of the question, international humanitarian law allows for starvation in these terms. It says, okay, part of international humanitarian law is to make a distinction between who's a civilian and who's an armed combatant. Civilians, armed combatants. Okay, what's international humanitarian law? It's the law that organizes violence. It tells you who you're allowed to kill. It's not about eliminating violence. So if you're my enemy and you're an armed combatant, I'm allowed to starve you. But if you're a civilian, technically speaking, I'm not allowed to starve you, and I'm not allowed to deny humanitarian aid. However, everybody in the humanitarian sector knows this. It's based on a false premise. There's very little distinction between military supply chains and civilian supply chains and humanitarian supply chains. So factually, if I starve my opponent's military, I will guarantee the starvation of civilians. So by allowing for starvation as a weapon of war against armed combatants, IHL enables starvation in practice and gives legal arguments to justify starvation. It was military necessity. It was proportional. And so that's the problem with the laws of war, is it always gives you a counter argument, which is why I wanted to pull starvation out of the laws of war and make it and frame it as always a matter of genocide, extermination, which is a crime against humanity, and torture, because in law there is no argument, there's no exception to genocide. Whereas in the laws of war, there's yes, but. Yes, we starved the civilians, but. However, you can't say, yeah, we genocided them, but. Yes, we tortured them, but. So I wanted to remove those legal exceptions to map onto existing reality.
Can I just, I think here there's a very interesting question of how Israel also not only conflated human rights law and IHL, which is the law that operates in times of war, by using the language of security and combating terrorism. So, which limits even people's recourse to the law. So, for example, in the case of in Gaza, Israel has engineered this calorie intake diet, right? Where is the legal avenue there? Like, how can we protest the calorie intake restriction or the collective punishment, or holding a full population in captivity with no right to choice of food, of calorie, what kind of food is allowed in Gaza or not? I think the way Israel conflates and uses the discourse of security and the discourse of terrorism takes it also out of IHL and out of human rights law discourses and avenues. And this is also another important area to think about, when and how Israel used the language of international law to its advantage, and then when and how used the human rights law, and when and how against Palestinians used the security discourse, which justifies later, like for example, when there is a full list of items, cardamom, coriander, pasta becomes a dual usage for security reasons, right? Just thinking about terrorism and security, not only IHL and human rights law.
Okay. We have time for one more question. I know it's two, but we had extra time. Not extra time, it was justified time. Yes, over here and in the back as well. So just wait for the microphone.
I just want to ask the question about terrorism, because usually in international law, there's a definition of terrorism, right? But where we see terrorism functions, usually in a different way. Like, for example, the resistance in Algeria. It was pretty much like terrorist based on today's definition. And how these kind of resistance over the world are categorized by these NGOs and international organizations as terrorism should be a topic we discuss about. And how you guys as like lawyers or people who work around this topic distinguish the difference between terrorism and resistance, and should there be a distinguish between these topics at the first place?
Okay, thank you. And over here, please, in the second row.
I just wanted to touch on the top thing you mentioned about the prosecution of potential combatants, or to put pressure on, chasing sort of or putting deterrence around people who are sort of dual citizen and using those avenues. And given that civil liberties are much stronger in sort of, some of the civil liberties are much stronger in Western societies. Is there any precedence for that, or is there any kind of can you cite an example where that's worked? And also taking that even further to the boardrooms, where organizations or companies or corporate entities make choices about sort of legal liability. So if their employees are actually participating in these activities, then they may be held liable, or I don't know if there's that. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just not.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle those questions first? And then we wrap up.
Okay. I'm going to give unsatisfactory answers, so I'm just telling you from now. To be honest, I just avoid, I can do this because I'm focused on food. Once we start talking terrorism, it empties out any nuanced discussion. And legal definitions of terrorism are relatively recent. So I'm kind of agreeing with you in terms of how these distinctions are made, but I just avoid all of that. It just shuts down any ability to think or to engage in a discussion. And who's always the terrorist? It's always the Arab or the Muslim in North America. Always. So it's such a racist discourse that I'm able to avoid it because I focus on food, to be honest. So that's my unsatisfactory answer. And on examples, it's interesting. I think it's fun. I always pay attention to what examples people have been using. Right now, the most common reference point tends to be South Africa, the apartheid era, and the boycott and divestment and sanctions of that era. But listening to Zeina's arguments, I think, is different. And I think it's the way I heard the discussion today is calling for something systemic for a campaign, but using legal tools of putting pressure in a way where it doesn't fit into today's BDS tactical handbook. And this is the first time I've heard you say legal beseechment. I think there's a lot there of what Zeina's talking about, where it's operating on multiple scales in multiple ways. But what it is required, I think, much like the BDS campaign, is a campaign. Like some sort of semi-coordinated something to engage in putting pressure, whether it's through corporate law, whether it's through financial law, whether banking. Like there's all these ways that are still unexplored that can be used in a systemic way. So I think until we articulate what Zeina was describing more fully, then we can maybe find examples. So that's my second unsatisfactory answer.
Okay. Thank you. Zeina?
On terrorism, I think we have more specialists that are and on social movement, you see footnote C. But I think when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli context, I think it's interesting to look at the manipulation of the law and how Israel has manipulated international law, and also the language of peace building and state recognition and the recognition of the Palestinian people to try to uproot the question of resistance, right? So for Israel, and we've seen this recently with the Israeli argument before the ICJ with the team of Israel, when they said Palestinians do not have the right to resist There is no resistance because there is what they are a state. So the act of resistance are basically acts of terrorism. So Israel has been for a while trying from September 11th onward, trying to use the discourse of terrorism to say there is no more occupation, you have a state, and therefore, if you have a state and we are at peace, then what you're doing, you're terrorizing the peaceful Israeli population. So there is this also logic of how to use different frameworks to manipulate the law and to persist with the legal strategies of the occupation, the structural violence. So reality on the ground is only bleaker and grimmer. But then when it comes to the legal discourse, it's another form of assault. It's no longer the right of the Palestinian people to resist, they become terrorists. And we have cases where Palestinians are being tried before the courts of terrorism courts. On the precedents, I don't have an example right now, and I don't think we have used enough the law to have precedents. But I believe personally that there is a possibility.
Well, we're out of time. I thank you so much for being so generous and sharing your insights and your reflections on a deeply painful subject. And thanks also to the audience. Thank you.